Hello, and welcome back to our channel. On screen, Rita Hayworth was the atomic bomb of sex appeal, the ultimate fantasy. But in the eyes of Orson Welles, she was a gaudy trinket that needed to be crushed. Fueled by a toxic mix of condescension and jealousy, he decided to burn the love goddess to the ground. He hacked off the hair that was her crown and bleached the ashes white, forcing her to play a monster in a funhouse mirror. This was not a director guiding a muse. It was a demolition job. Welles didn't just want to change her image, he wanted to burn it down. To understand the violence of this moment, one must realize that Rita Hayworth was a construct. She was born Margarita Cancino, talented but considered too ethnic for 1930s Hollywood. When she signed with Columbia Pictures, studio boss Harry Cohn ordered her erasure. He demanded starvation diets and, most brutally, 2 years of painful electrolysis to raise her hairline, killing the follicles one by one to open up her face. Out of this torture emerged Rita Hayworth, the red-headed love goddess, the absolute property of the studio. Then she met Orson Welles. He was the boy wonder behind Citizen Kane, a genius who despised the very star system that created his wife. When they married in 1943, the press called it Beauty and the Brain. Rita, insecure and desperate for a home, looked at Welles and saw a protector who could shield her from the predators who ran her life. Welles looked at Rita and saw something else. He didn't see the goddess, he saw the camp. He saw the artificiality. He was fascinated by her, but he didn't respect her profession. To a man who read Shakespeare for fun and directed high art, being a movie star was a vulgar existence. He famously said, "Rita is a sweet girl, but she has no idea who she is." He loved her in his own narcissist way, but he loved her as a collector loves a rare object. And like any arrogant collector, he resented the fact that his object had been created by someone else. He hated that when he walked down the street with his wife, men shouted Gilded. He hated that her identity belonged to Harry Cohn. His ego could not sustain the idea that he was married to a studio prop. By 1946, the marriage was already a smoking ruin. Welles had grown bored. He was cheating on her. He was spending her money. Rita was drinking heavily, sliding into the depression that would plague her entire life. She realized that Orson didn't want a wife. He wanted an audience. She had once said the most heartbreaking line in Hollywood history: "Men go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with me." She knew she was a disappointment the moment the makeup came off. Welles made her feel that disappointment every day. He treated her intellectual insecurities with condescension. He filled their house with intellectuals and politicians, holding court while Rita sat silently in the corner, terrified to speak and reveal her lack of education. But they were still legally married, and they were both in trouble. Rita was trapped in her fame, and Welles was trapped in debt. He had burned bridges at every major studio. He needed money, and he needed it fast. In a moment of frantic improvisation, standing in a phone booth, Welles called Harry Cohn. He pitched a movie. He didn't have a script. He had a paperback book he had glanced at in a drugstore called If I Die Before I Wake. He told Cohn, "I'll write it, I'll direct it, and it will star my wife." It was a deal with the devil. Welles, who despised Cohn, was using Cohn's obsession with Rita to bail himself out of financial ruin. Cohn agreed immediately. He offered $50,000 to Welles on the spot. He thought he was buying Gilda Part 2. He thought he was getting the glamorous couple of the century in a glossy, romantic thriller. He had no idea that he had just handed a loaded gun to a man who hated him. Welles took the money and wrote the script for The Lady from Shanghai. As he typed the pages, a dark plan began to form. He wasn't writing a vehicle for Rita Hayworth. He was writing her obituary. He poured all his frustration with their marriage, all his contempt for her celebrity, and all his hatred for Hollywood into the character of Elsa Bannister. Elsa was not the fun, singing, dancing girl next door. Elsa was a damaged, cynical, manipulative woman who used her beauty to entrap men. She was a former prostitute in China, a woman with a dark past and a cold heart. Welles was writing a version of Rita that stripped away the illusion. He was saying, "You think she's a goddess? Let me show you the rot underneath." The haircut was the first physical manifestation of this script. It was a territory marking. By chopping off the hair, Welles was severing the visual link to Harry Cohn. He was saying, "Cohn made Gilda. I killed her. This is my creation now." The atmosphere on the lot that day in 1946 was heavy with dread. The studio publicists were hyperventilating. They tried to frame it as a new look for the post-war era, but everyone knew it was sabotage. The photographers snapped their pictures, capturing the piles of red hair on the linoleum floor. Those photos would run in newspapers across the country the next day. The reaction was instant and visceral. Fans wrote letters of outrage. It was as if Welles had defaced the Statue of Liberty. But Rita sat in the chair, silent. She touched the back of her neck, feeling the cold air against her skin for the first time in years. She looked at Orson in the mirror. He was smiling around his cigar, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who had just broken a very expensive toy. He walked over to her, touched her short, bleached hair, and told her she looked chic. It was a lie. She looked hard. She looked like a woman who had seen too much. She looked exactly like he wanted her to look, like his property. Harry Cohn didn't see the haircut until the next day. When he saw the photos, the blood drained from his face. He screamed so loud he could be heard in the parking lot. "He ruined her," Cohn bellowed. "He ruined my property." Cohn knew with the instinct of a predator that the magic of Rita Hayworth was in her softness, her accessibility. By making her jagged and cold, Welles had damaged the commercial viability of the studio's greatest asset. But production had begun. The contracts were signed. Cohn couldn't stop it. He had to watch helplessly as the boy wonder took his $1,000,000 racehorse and broke its legs just to see if it could still run. Welles hustled the production out of Hollywood quickly. He moved the shoot to Acapulco, Mexico. He wanted to get Rita away from the studio spies, away from Cohn's protection, and isolate her in his own world. He rented a yacht, the Zaca, owned by the actor Errol Flynn. The yacht would serve as the primary set and the base of operations. It sounded glamorous. A yacht trip in Mexico with the most beautiful woman in the world. But as the crew boarded the Zaca and the shoreline of California disappeared, the reality set in. This was not a vacation. It was a prison ship. Orson Welles was the warden, and Rita Hayworth was the prisoner who was about to undergo a psychological dismantling that would leave scars far deeper than the burns on her scalp. The transformation was complete. Gilda was dead, left on the barbershop floor in Hollywood. Elsa Bannister was alive, sailing south into a storm of humidity, sickness, and cruelty. The camera was loaded. The lights were rigged. Orson Welles was ready to shoot his masterpiece, and he was ready to sacrifice his wife to do it. The stage for this nightmare was the Zaca, a 118-foot black-hulled schooner owned by Errol Flynn. Once a swashbuckling hero, Flynn was now rotting from the inside out, a functioning addict captaining a ship of fools. He had rented the yacht to Welles, and as part of the deal, he captained the ship. The decision to trap the most insecure woman in Hollywood on a boat with two colossal self-destructive egos, Welles and Flynn, was not just a logistical error. It was a recipe for psychological warfare. The location was Acapulco, Mexico. The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on the deck of the Zaca, suffocating the air, turning the cabins into ovens. The humidity was so thick it curled the pages of the script and made the expensive makeup on Rita Hayworth's face slide off like melting wax. This was not the sanitized, air-conditioned environment of the Columbia soundstage. There were no assistants with battery-powered fans, no craft service tables laden with iced fruit. There was only the blinding sun, the smell of diesel fuel, and the constant rhythmic lurch of the ocean. Orson Welles thrived in the chaos. He was the ringmaster of this floating circus. He wore a captain's hat, chomped on expensive cigars, and barked orders through a megaphone. He treated the Zaca not as a film set, but as a laboratory where he could deconstruct his wife. The script for The Lady from Shanghai was fluid. Welles wrote new pages every morning, often handing them to the actors minutes before the cameras rolled. This was a deliberate tactic. He knew Rita Hayworth was not a method actor. She was a trained performer who relied on preparation, on memorization, on the safety of knowing her marks. By changing the lines constantly, by removing the safety net, Welles kept her in a state of perpetual anxiety. He wanted Elsa Bannister to look unsure, shifty, and uncomfortable. He achieved this by making Rita Hayworth unsure, shifty, and uncomfortable. The cinematography was the primary weapon of his assault. In the studio system, the camera was a lover to the female star, using soft lenses to create an ethereal, angelic glow. Welles threw those techniques overboard. He demanded the image be crisp, harsh, and distorted. He placed the camera low, looking up at Rita. In cinema language, a low angle usually empowers a character, but combined with the wide lens and the harsh Mexican sunlight, it had a grotesque effect. It elongated her features. It made her look predatory. It caught the tension in her jaw and the hardness in her eyes. There is a scene filmed on the deck of the yacht where Rita is sunbathing. She is wearing a swimsuit, her body exposed to the sun and the lens. A traditional director would have filmed this as a pinup shot, a moment of titillation for the audience. Welles filmed it as in dissection. The camera lingers on her, but not with lust. It looks at her with suspicion. She looks cold, distant, almost reptilian. This was the anti-glamour technique. Welles was saying to the audience, "You want to stare at her? Fine. Look closer. Look at the monster." The atmosphere on the boat became toxic. The crew began to fall ill. The heat and the bad water caused an outbreak of dysentery. Technicians were vomiting over the railings. The stench of sickness mixed with the smell of the sea. Errol Flynn, high on narcotics, would sometimes steer the ship erratically, terrifying the insurance agents on board. Flynn and Welles would spend the nights drinking heavily, engaging in loud, boisterous debates about art and politics, their laughter echoing over the water while Rita retreated to her cabin, locking the door. She was the only woman in a boys' club of madmen. Rita was actually a better sailor than Welles. She had stamina, but the psychological toll was heavier than the seasickness. She was surrounded by Welles's court, a group of intellectuals and actors he had brought along. They spoke in references she didn't understand. They made inside jokes. Welles did nothing to include her. In fact, he used her exclusion to fuel her performance. He needed Elsa Bannister to feel isolated and resentful so he made sure Rita Hayworth felt isolated and resentful. He was directing her life to get the reaction he needed for his film. One afternoon, the production was halted by a crisis involving the makeup. The platinum blonde hair, which had already traumatized Rita, was reacting badly to the salt water and the harsh sun. It was turning a sickly shade of green. The hairdresser panicked. In a normal production, this would be a disaster. The star's hair must be perfect. Welles, however, was strangely unbothered. He liked the degradation. He liked the fact that the artificiality was breaking down. He forced Rita to endure endless hours of touch-ups, harsh chemical bleaches applied directly to her sunburned scalp to strip the green out. She sat in the makeup chair on the swaying boat, the smell of ammonia burning her nose, while Welles paced the deck, screaming about the lighting setup. He treated her pain as a logistical inconvenience, nothing more. The script itself was a funhouse mirror of their failing marriage. Welles had written dialogue for Elsa that was cruel in its precision. In one scene, the character Michael O'Hara, played by Welles, looks at Elsa and says, "You don't know how to take care of yourself, do you? You never learned." It was a line Welles had likely said to Rita in their living room 100 times. He was forcing her to reenact their domestic collapse for the camera. He made her say lines about being trapped, about being owned, about being a product of her environment. He was putting his own contempt for her lifestyle into the mouth of the character who falls in love with her, only to betray her. There was a specific cruelty in how he directed her voice. Rita had a soft, high-pitched speaking voice. It was part of her Gilded charm, the innocent girl trapped in a woman's body. Welles ordered her to drop her register. He wanted her to sound lower, huskier, more cynical. He drilled her on the line readings until her voice was flat and devoid of emotion. He stripped the music out of her speech. He wanted a monotone of indifference. When the executives at Columbia saw the dailies, they were baffled. "She sounds like she's asleep," one executive complained. "No," another corrected. "She sounds like she's dead." Meanwhile, back in Hollywood, Harry Cohn was losing his mind. The reports coming from the Zaca were catastrophic. The budget was ballooning. The schedule was a fantasy. The footage arriving in the mail was dark, weird, and unsexy. Cohn tried to intervene. He sent telegrams demanding that Welles shoot more close-ups, more beauty shots. He demanded that Rita sing a song. In the 40s, a Rita Hayworth movie without a musical number was unthinkable. It was like a Fred Astaire movie without dancing. Welles received the telegrams and laughed. He crumpled them up and threw them into the Pacific Ocean. But he knew he had to throw the studio a bone to keep the financing flowing. He agreed to shoot a song, but he did it his way. The song was "Please Don't Kiss Me," a standard romantic ballad. A director like Charles Vidor, who directed Gilded, would have put Rita in a sequined gown on a stage with a spotlight and a backing band. Welles filmed her singing it on the deck of the yacht, with the wind whipping her short, bleached hair across her face. He didn't have her lip sync to a pre-recorded track with energy. He had her sing it quietly, almost to herself. The camera drifted away from her during the song, focusing on the horizon, on the shadows. He undercut the performance. He refused to give the audience the satisfaction of the showstopper. He turned the musical number into a moment of loneliness. The tension on the Zaca culminated in the death of a crew member. It wasn't on camera, but it hung over the production like a shroud. One of the assistant cameramen suffered a heart attack and died. The isolation of the location meant that medical help was too far away. The body was transported to shore. A normal production might have paused for mourning. Welles pushed on. He was possessed. The film was already over budget, and he felt the walls closing in. The callousness of the production environment reinforced the nihilism of the movie. Everyone on that boat felt like they were part of a doomed expedition. Rita began to drink more heavily. It was her only escape. She would sit on the deck at night, looking at the black water, holding a glass of scotch. Welles would sometimes join her, not as a husband, but as a director observing his subject. He watched her disintegration with a clinical eye. He saw the way the alcohol made her movements sloppy, the way it dulled the light in her eyes. And the next day he would ask her to channel that sloppiness into Elsa. He was consuming her sadness and printing it onto celluloid. There's a pivotal scene in the film where Elsa explains her worldview to Michael. She talks about sharks. She says if one of them gets cut, the rest of them turn and tear him to pieces. It is the central metaphor of the film. But on that yacht, Rita was the bleeding shark. And Orson Welles, Errol Flynn, and the camera crew were the frenzy. They were tearing her image to pieces. As the Mexican leg of the chute wrapped, the Zaca limped back toward the United States. The footage they had captured was unlike anything Hollywood had ever produced. It was disjointed, feverish, and visually aggressive. It looked like a nightmare. Rita Hayworth stepped off that boat a different woman. Her skin was tanned leather tough by the sun. Her hair was a chemical disaster, and her spirit was crushed. She had spent weeks being told by the man she loved that she was nothing more than a pretty vacuous shell that needed to be broken to be interesting. But the torture was not over. The yacht was just the first circle of hell. The production moved to San Francisco for the location shoots. Here, Welles would escalate his attack on the brand. He planned a sequence in the Steinhardt Aquarium. He wanted to film Rita and himself silhouetted against the tanks of sharks and moray eels. The symbolism was bludgeoning. He placed the love goddess next to monsters of the deep. He lit the scene so that the shadows of sharks and moray eels swam across her face, distorting her features. He directed Rita to stand still, to be as cold as the glass of the tank, visually suggesting that she was just another predator behind the glass. During the San Francisco shoot, the marriage officially expired. They were living in separate hotels. The divorce lawyers were drafting the papers while the camera crew was setting up the lights. It was a surreal existence. By day, they played lovers caught in a deadly web of deceit. By night, they were litigants in a divorce settlement. The lines between reality and fiction evaporated completely. When Rita looked at Orson with hatred in the film, it was real hatred. When Orson looked at Rita with distrust, it was real distrust. Welles was spending money he didn't have. He was renting cranes, helicopters, and thousands of extras. Harry Cohn was sending furious memos about the budget. "You are spending money like a drunken sailor," Cohn wrote. Welles replied, "I am making art." But Welles knew the truth. He was making a bomb. He knew that the film was too weird, too dark, and too hostile to the audience to be a commercial hit. And he didn't care. In fact, failure was part of the plan. If the film failed, Rita's star power would dim. If her star power dimmed, she would be less valuable to Harry Cohn. Welles was willing to tank his own career if it meant taking Cohn's prized possession down with him. The climax of this campaign of destruction was set for a soundstage in Hollywood, where Welles had ordered the construction of a massive, intricate set, the Crazy House. It was a fun house at an amusement park. He designed it to be a surrealist nightmare. Distorted slides, spinning tunnels, and trap doors. And at the heart of the Crazy House, he built the Hall of Mirrors. This set was the final battlefield. It was here that Welles planned to stage the literal shattering of Rita Hayworth. He ordered the prop department to buy hundreds of mirrors. He wanted mirrors on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He wanted a kaleidoscope of Ritas. On the day of the shoot, Rita walked onto the set. She was wearing a white dress cut simply, almost austere. She looked at the mirrors. Everywhere she turned, she saw herself. But she didn't see Gilda. She saw the short-haired, platinum blonde stranger that Welles had created. She saw the woman who had lost her husband, her confidence, and her identity. Welles handed her a gun. It was a prop gun, but it felt heavy. He took his own gun. He explained the scene. "We are going to shoot each other," he said, "but we aren't shooting the bodies. We are shooting the reflections. I want you to shatter everything." The symbolism was suffocating. The crew stood in silence, sensing they weren't just watching a movie scene. They were witnessing the public dismantling of a wife by her husband. Welles called action. Rita stepped into the maze. The lights flared off the glass. She saw 100 versions of herself staring back. And for the first time in the entire production, the fear on her face was not acting. She was lost in the labyrinth of her own fame, trapped by the man who claimed to know her better than anyone. Welles entered the frame. He was sweating. He looked manic. He raised his gun. He wasn't aiming at Rita. He was aiming at the mirror behind her. He squeezed the trigger. The sound of the blank charge was deafening in the enclosed set. The mirror exploded. Shards of glass rained down. The image of Rita Hayworth shattered into jagged splinters. Rita screamed. It was in the script, but the scream came from her gut. She raised her gun and fired back. Another mirror shattered. Another image destroyed. They kept firing. Smash, smash, smash. The sound of breaking glass became a rhythm. With every shot, another piece of the love goddess was erased. Welles was destroying the idol. He was smashing the idol he had grown to hate. He was laughing as he fired. He was purging himself of his obsession with her celebrity. When the director finally called cut, the floor of the soundstage was covered in inches of broken glass. Rita stood in the middle of the wreckage, shaking. She looked at the shards on the floor. In every piece of glass, a tiny fragmented piece of her face looked back up at her. Orson Welles walked over to her. He didn't hug her. He didn't congratulate her. He looked at the destruction he had caused, at the millions of jagged pieces of glass that reflected the studio lights like diamonds. That, he said, was cinema. He had gotten his shot. He had destroyed the room. He had destroyed the image. The movie was in the can. The marriage was over. The execution was complete. All that was left now was for the public to see the body. The gunshots in the Hall of Mirrors marked the end of the filming, but the violence didn't stop when the cameras cut. It simply changed venues. The footage, chaotic, brilliant, and cruel, was shipped back to Hollywood, where the physical torture of the heat and the sea was replaced by the cold surgical butchery of the editing room. Welles had captured the soul of his wife on celluloid, and now, with a pair of scissors in hand, he prepared to rearrange the pieces into a puzzle that even the studio that owned her wouldn't recognize. The shards of glass on the floor of the Columbia Sound stage were swept away by union janitors, but the damage Orson Welles had inflicted on the footage was permanent. The principal photography of the lady from Shanghai had concluded, but the torture of the material was just beginning. If the production phase was an assault, post-production was a mutilation. Welles retreated into the editing bay. This was his bunker. To a director of his caliber, the editing room is where the film is truly written. It is where he controls time, space, and emotion. But Welles was not editing The Lady from Shanghai to be a coherent narrative. He was editing it to be a fever dream. He took the reels of film, the physical celluloid that captured the disintegration of his wife, and he began to chop them up with a manic intensity. The Hall of Mirrors sequence, the film's violent climax, had originally been shot as a 20-minute tour de force of visual disorientation. It was a masterpiece of blocking and choreography. But in the cutting room, Welles took a pair of scissors to his own genius. He slashed the sequence down to a frenetic 3-minute burst of confusion. He removed the establishing shots. He removed the spatial logic. He wanted the audience to feel nauseous. He wanted the visual experience to mimic the feeling of a nervous breakdown. Harry Cohn, the studio boss, demanded to see a rough cut. He sat in his private screening room, a lit cigar in his hand, expecting to see a noir thriller that would rival The Maltese Falcon. As the lights went down and the projector whirred to life, Cohn's confusion turned into a slow-burning rage. The film he watched made no sense. The plot was a labyrinth of nonsensical betrayals, double crosses, and incomprehensible dialogue. Characters appeared and disappeared without explanation. The courtroom scene was a farce, and at the center of it all was Rita Hayworth, his Rita, his Gilda, looking like a jagged, hard-edged stranger. She wasn't glowing, she was glaring. She wasn't the warm, inviting sex symbol of the 40s. She was a cold, alien creature trapped in a nightmare. When the lights came up, the silence in the room was heavier than lead. Cohn stood up, ashes falling from his cigar onto his expensive suit. He famously looked at his executives and shouted, "I'll give $1,000 to anyone who can explain the plot of this movie to me." No one collected the money. Cohn realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that he had been conned. Orson Welles hadn't made a movie. He had made an experimental art project on the studio's dime. He had taken Columbia's most valuable commercial asset and used her to make a film that was actively hostile to the commercial audience. Cohn was so horrified by the final product that he refused to release it. This was the shelf strategy. In Hollywood, if a movie is bad, you release it quietly and hope it disappears. If a movie is a disaster that threatens the studio's reputation, you bury it. Cohn buried The Lady from Shanghai. He locked the film cans in the vault. He put the release on indefinite hold. For Rita Hayworth, this was a catastrophe. An actress's career is built on momentum. She was the biggest star in the world, but she had been absent from the screen for nearly 2 years during the production. Now, her comeback vehicle was being held hostage. She was in limbo. The public began to wonder where she was. Rumors swirled. Was she sick? Was she disfigured? Had she retired? Welles, true to his nature, didn't stick around to fight for the film. He had already mentally moved on. He was done with Hollywood. He was done with the studio system. And, effectively, he was done with Rita. He packed his bags and moved to Europe to film Macbeth. He left his wife alone in Hollywood to deal with the lawyers, the studio, and the wreckage of their marriage. The divorce proceedings took place during this strange purgatory. On November 10th, 1947, Rita Hayworth stood before a judge in Los Angeles. She was not playing a role. There were no lights, no scripts, no retakes. She wore a modest suit. She looked tired. When asked why she was filing for divorce, she didn't talk about the haircut. She didn't talk about the grueling shoot on the Zaca. She used the standard legal euphemism of the time, mental cruelty. Mr. Welles showed no interest in establishing a home, she told the judge. He never came home. He showed no interest in me. It was a quiet, pathetic end to the Beauty and the Brain narrative. The judge granted the divorce. Rita walked out of the courthouse a single woman, but she was still contractually shackled to the man who had abandoned her. She still had to promote his movie if Cohn ever decided to release it. For an entire year, the lady from Shanghai gathered dust. It became a legend within the industry. The cursed film, the monster that ate Rita Hayworth's hair. Finally, in 1948, Harry Cohn decided he needed to recoup some of his losses. He couldn't burn the negative, so he had to sell it. The marketing campaign for the film was a masterpiece of deceit. Columbia Pictures knew they couldn't sell the movie Welles had made, so they decided to sell a movie that didn't exist. The posters screamed in bright, bold letters, "The Terrific Team, Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles." They used illustrations that made Rita look like Gilda, long red hair flowing, a red dress clinging to her curves. They lied. They promised the audience a sizzling romance. They promised the return of the love goddess. When the film finally premiered in June 1948, the audience walked into the theater expecting Gilda too. They sat down with their popcorn, ready to be seduced. What they got was an assault. From the opening frames, the audience was confused. Who was this blonde woman with the cold eyes? Why was the hero, Welles, speaking with a bizarre Irish brogue? Why was the plot so impossible to follow? As the film unspooled, confusion turned to hostility. They watched their beloved Rita, playing a woman who lies, cheats, and manipulates. They waited for the musical number, for the moment she would shake her hair and smile. It never came. Instead, they got the aquarium scene, where she looked like a shark. They got the funhouse scene, where she was shattered into glass. The ending of the film was the final insult. In a standard Hollywood romance, the girl gets the guy, or at least dies tragically in his arms. In The Lady from Shanghai, Elsa Bannister lies dying on the floor of the crazy house, shot in the gut. Michael O'Hara stands over her. He doesn't hold her. He doesn't cry. He looks down at her with cold indifference. His final voiceover is one of the most cynical lines in movie history. "I went to the phone and called the cops. Maybe I'll live so long that I'll forget her. Maybe I'll die trying." He walks away. He leaves her to die alone on the floor of a carnival attraction. The audience was appalled. They felt punished. The film flopped. It didn't just fail, it was rejected. The box office receipts were dismal. Critics were baffled. The New York Times called it a piece of cinematic trickery. For Rita Hayworth, the failure was personal. She had trusted Orson. She had let him strip away her armor, her Gilda defense, believing that he would replace it with something artistic and substantial. Instead, he had stripped her naked and left her to die on the floor of a fun house. She was exposed as not being a serious actress in the eyes of the critics, and she was rejected as a star by her fans. She had lost both worlds. Welles, safe in Europe, shrugged off the failure. To him, the commercial flopping of the film was a badge of honor. It proved he was ahead of his time. It proved that the American public was too stupid to understand his vision. He didn't care that he had spent Rita's political capital to prove his point. The destruction of the Rita Hayworth brand was total. Before The Lady from Shanghai, she was untouchable. After it, she was damaged goods. The mystery was gone. The illusion was broken. Welles had shown the wires. He had shown the audience that the doll was hollow. Harry Cohn was vindictive. He blamed Rita for the failure. He felt that she had allowed Welles to ruin her. He began to treat her with open contempt. He put her in mediocre films. He refused to give her the pay raises she deserved. He treated her like a bad investment that he was trying to liquidate. Rita's psychological state deteriorated. She began to internalize the failure. She looked in the mirror and didn't know who she was anymore. She wasn't Gilda. She wasn't Elsa. She was just a tired woman with fried hair and a broken heart. Decades later, the film refused to stay buried. In the 40s, it was a failure. But French critics from famous film magazines rediscovered it. They didn't see a mess. They saw a subversive masterpiece. They praised the confusion and the surrealism, the very things American audiences had hated. They hailed Orson Welles as a visionary. They called the Hall of Mirrors scene one of the greatest moments in the history of visual art. But what about Rita? The rehabilitation of the film did not rehabilitate the woman. Film students today watch The Lady from Shanghai and marvel at the camera angles. They analyze the lighting. They write essays about the symbolism of the sharks. They rarely talk about the woman in the center of the frame. They rarely talk about the fact that the terror in her eyes was real. They treat her as an object, just as Harry Cohn did, just as Orson Welles did. She remains the lady from Shanghai, a figure trapped in a maze of someone else's making. The film captures her at the precise moment her stardom was sacrificed on the altar of the director's ego. It is a snuff film of a career. Welles would go on to make other movies, to become a legend of independent cinema. He would grow fat, famous, and revered. He would tell stories on talk shows about poor Rita, speaking of her with a wistful sadness, as if she were a tragic accident that happened to him, rather than a person he systematically dismantled. He never apologized. Genius never apologizes. Rita Hayworth drifted. She married Prince Ali Khan, becoming a princess for a brief, unhappy time. She married the singer Dick Hames. She married producer James Hill. She was looking for someone to save her, someone to put the pieces of the mirror back together. But you cannot fix a mirror once it is shattered. You can only see a distorted reflection. In her later years, as Alzheimer's began to steal her memories, Rita would often watch her old movies. She would watch Gilded. She would watch herself dancing, shaking that long red hair, smiling that $1,000,000 smile. She would smile back at the screen, recognizing the woman who used to exist. But she reportedly never watched The Lady from Shanghai. She couldn't bear to look at the blonde stranger. She couldn't bear to look at the crime scene. The murder of the Rita Hayworth brand was a perfect crime. There was no body to bury. There was no jail time for the perpetrator. The evidence was projected on screens all over the world, disguised as entertainment. Orson Welles had committed the ultimate act of possession. He had destroyed the thing he could not truly own, ensuring that no one else could ever see it the same way again. He branded her permanently. Orson Welles didn't just direct a film, he carved his initials into her psyche. And in the end, the Hall of Mirrors is the only truth left. We are still looking at Rita Hayworth through the shards of glass that Orson Welles broke. We see the beauty, but it is fragmented. We see the icon, but it is cracked. The film ends with the line, "Maybe I'll die trying." Rita Hayworth did die trying. She died trying to find the woman who existed before the haircut, before the bleaching, before the genius decided to turn her into his masterpiece of destruction. The box office failure of The Lady from Shanghai was deafening, but for Rita, the silence that followed was worse. The industry didn't just reject the film, they recoiled from the woman in it. Welles had successfully stripped her of her armor, but he had left her with no skin underneath. Exposed, humiliated, and commercially damaged, Rita did what she always did when Hollywood turned cold. She ran. She sought warmth in the arms of royalty, hoping that a prince could fix what a genius had broken. But she was about to learn that a gilded cage is still a cage. The sound of a career dying is not a bang. It is the silence of a telephone that refuses to ring. In 1948, Following the disastrous release of The Lady from Shanghai, the phone in Rita Hayworth's Beverly Hills home went dead. The silence was absolute. Before the film, scripts arrived in stacks tied with ribbons, accompanied by flowers and desperate notes from producers begging for her attention. After the film, the mail brought only bills and legal notices. Orson Welles had successfully inoculated the industry against Rita Hayworth. By presenting her as a cold, murderous, short-haired villain, he had confused the marketplace. Hollywood is a business of simple categorization. You are the virgin, the vixen, the mother, or the crone. Rita had been the vixen. Welles had turned her into something uncategorizable, an avant-garde experiment in alienation. Producers looked at the box office returns of The Lady from Shanghai and drew a single brutal conclusion. The public does not want to pay to see Rita Hayworth act. They only want to pay to see Rita Hayworth tease. And since Welles had stripped her of her tease, she was momentarily worthless. Desperate to escape the shadow of the love goddess and the failure of her intellectual marriage with Welles, Rita swung the pendulum to the opposite extreme. If the genius couldn't save her, perhaps the fairy tale prince could. Enter Prince Ali Khan. He was the son of the Aga Khan, a playboy of legendary wealth. He pursued Rita with the same intensity that Welles had, but his weapon was not art. It was opulence. In 1949, Rita broke her contract with Columbia, packed her bags, and left America. She told the press she was done with movies. She was going to be a princess. But tragedy is circular. Rita fled one cage only to find herself in another, more gilded one. Ali Khan was not a savior. He was a collector. He paraded Rita around the French Riviera like a trophy. He expected her to be the life of the party, and when she proved to be shy and introverted, he grew bored. The infidelity began almost immediately. Rita found herself in a palace, surrounded by servants, but completely alone, a foreigner in her own marriage. By 1952, the fairy tale was over. Humiliated, broke, and with 2 daughters to support, she had to crawl back to the only place that would pay her, Harry Cohn's office. The meeting was legendary in its cruelty. Cohn sat behind his desk, the man who had predicted she would fail without him. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a contract with a pay cut. He told her she was damaged goods and ordered the production of a fair in Trinidad, 1952. The cynicism of this production was breathtaking. Cohn essentially ordered a remake of Gilded. He forced Rita to grow her hair back, dye it red, and put her in strapless gowns that mimicked the 40s. The marketing screamed, "Rortedi, she is back, the hair is back." But you cannot step into the same river twice. In Gilded, her sexuality was playful. In Trinidad, it felt performative and exhausted. She was moving through the motions of seduction like a factory worker operating heavy machinery. The camera, once her lover, was now a forensic investigator looking for cracks in the porcelain. The film made money, but the truth was visible. The sadness Welles had exposed was now permanent. The 1950s were a slow-motion crucifixion for Rita Hayworth. The roles she was offered were insults. She was cast as the aging beauty, the alcoholic, the woman with a past. Hollywood was punishing her for aging, and it was punishing her for the artistic rebellion of The Lady from Shanghai. It was during this period that the behavior began, the fog. Directors started to complain that Rita couldn't remember her lines. She would show up to set looking disoriented. She would stare blankly when given directions. She would become agitated and angry over small things. The industry diagnosis was immediate and unanimous. She's a drunk. It fit the narrative perfectly. The tragic star broken by men drowning her sorrows in vodka. Gossip columnists wrote blind items about her stumbling at parties, but they were wrong. Something far darker than alcohol was taking hold, a tragedy that would not be understood for another 20 years. When she couldn't remember a line, it wasn't because she was hungover. It was because she was losing something much more vital than her sobriety. Welles, from his vantage point in Europe, occasionally commented on her. He was building his own legend as the exiled genius. He spoke of Rita with a patronizing affection. He framed himself as the one man who truly understood her, even as he ignored the fact that his film had been the catalyst for her professional decline. He never stepped in to defend her against the drunk rumors. He allowed the narrative to stand because it made his own narrative, that of the brilliant artist burdened by a troubled muse, more compelling. In 1957, she starred in Pal Joey with Frank Sinatra. It was her last great gasp of stardom. She played an older, wealthy widow, a sugar mama. She was still beautiful, but the hardness that Welles had brought out in The Lady from Shanghai was now etched permanently into her face. There is a scene where she sings, bewitched, bothered, and bewildered. She isn't lip-syncing to a youthful track. She is singing with a voice that sounds tired, resigned, and deeply cynical. Sinatra, to his credit, was kind to her. He demanded she get top billing. But even he couldn't stop the slide. The industry saw a woman who was difficult, slow, and unpredictable. They didn't see a sick woman, they saw a difficult diva. The most harrowing stories come from the sets of her final films in the late 60s and early 70s. On the set of The Wrath of God, 1972, her final film, she could not remember a single line of dialogue. The director had to film her scene line by line. She was terrified. She would look at the camera with the panic of a trapped animal. The crew, frustrated and cruel, mocked her behind her back. They called her the Walking Dead. This is the long echo of the gunshot in the Hall of Mirrors. Orson Welles had shattered her image symbolically in 1947. 25 years later, her mind was shattering, literally. The two events are linked by the thread of trauma. Welles had taught her that her value lay entirely in her ability to perform, to be the object of the gaze. When the disease took away her ability to perform, she was left with nothing. She had no inner fortress to retreat to because Welles had dismantled it. He had spent their marriage telling her she had no intellect, no depth, no self. So when the exterior crumbled, there was no foundation to hold her up. Her daughters, Rebecca and Yasmin, watched this decline with helplessness. They were the ones who saw the truth behind the drunk rumors. They saw their mother staring at a wall for hours, unable to recognize the house she lived in. They saw the love goddess throwing fits of rage because she couldn't remember how to tie her shoes. And where was the industry? Where were the men who had made millions off her image? Harry Cohn was dead, having worked himself into a grave. Orson Welles was obese and famous, holding court on talk shows, telling charming anecdotes about the old days. Ali Khan was dead, killed in a car crash. Rita was alone. The phone that stopped ringing in 1948 never truly started ringing again. The silence just grew louder, filling up the rooms of her mind until it pushed everything else out. The brand was dead. Gilda was a clip on the late-night movie channel. Elsa Bannister was a cult favorite for film students. But Margarita Cancino was trapped in a body that was still beautiful, carrying a brain that was slowly turning to dust. The destruction was so total that when the end finally came, the world had already forgotten she was alive. They thought she had died years ago, back when the hair was cut, back when the mirror was broken. They didn't realize that the woman had survived the execution, only to die by inches in the dark. The final public execution of Rita Hayworth did not happen on a movie set. It happened at Heathrow Airport in London in 1976. By this time, the love goddess had retreated from the screen, but the paparazzi had not retreated from her life. They were waiting at the gate when she disembarked from a TWA flight. Rita was 57 years old, but she looked 70. Her hair was disheveled. Her eyes were wild and unfocused. She was shouting at the flight attendants, confused about where she was, unable to find her luggage. The press photographers swarmed. They did not see a woman in medical distress. They saw a scoop. Flash bulbs exploded in her face, triggering a panic attack. The photos that ran in the tabloids the next day were grotesque. The headlines were unanimous and cruel. Rita Hayworth, drunk and disorderly. The fall of a star. Sad Rita's booze battle. The world looked at those photos and shook its head. It was the predictable third act of the Hollywood tragedy script. The beauty who fades, the star who cannot let go, the bottle that replaces the applause. It was a comfortable narrative because it placed the blame squarely on Rita. She was weak. She was a lush. She had thrown it all away. But the narrative was a lie. Rita Hayworth was not drunk. She had not touched a drop of alcohol on that flight. She was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease, a condition that, in 1976, was virtually unknown to the general public and poorly understood by the medical community. The drunkenness was actually the misfiring of neurons. The anger was the terror of a brain that could no longer process spatial reality. For 20 years since the filming of The Lady from Shanghai, Orson Welles had told the world that Rita was unstable. He had painted her as an emotional child, a woman with no intellectual depth. That characterization had stuck. It became the lens through which everyone, doctors, agents, fans, viewed her behavior. When she forgot lines, they assumed she was lazy. When she stumbled, they assumed she was intoxicated. Welles had destroyed her credibility so thoroughly that when she lost her mind, no one believed it was a tragedy. They thought it was a lifestyle choice. While Rita was being dragged through the mud of the British tabloids, Orson Welles was enjoying a renaissance of celebrity. He was no longer the lean, hungry wolf who directed Citizen Kane. He was a massive, bearded patriarch, a fixture on the talk show circuit. He sat in the guest chair for Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin, wearing black caftans to hide his immense girth, holding a cigar, and telling charming stories about the Golden Age. He was the great raconteur. He performed magic tricks for the audience. He made cards disappear. He made coins vanish. And in a way, he made Rita disappear too. When interviewers asked about her, he would sigh with a performative sadness. He would say things like, "Rita was a wonderful girl, but she was doomed." He spoke of her in the past tense, even though she was still alive. He framed himself as the benevolent genius who had tried to save her from the studio wolves, conveniently omitting the fact that he was the wolf who had bitten the hardest. He never corrected the drunk rumors. He never used his massive platform to say, "Stop attacking her." He let the public believe she was a mess because it validated his own narrative that he was the intellectual giant who had been dragged down by a hysterical, simple-minded beauty. The contrast in 1976 was stark. Welles was dining at a famous French restaurant in Hollywood, eating foie gras and holding court with young filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, who worshipped him. Rita was locked in her house, covering the mirrors with blankets because she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Welles was being celebrated for The Lady from Shanghai. Critics were now calling it a subversive masterpiece, while the woman who was sacrificed to make it was being spat on by the culture. The only person standing between Rita and total oblivion was Yasmin Khan. Yasmin was the daughter of Rita and Prince Ali Khan. She had grown up in the shadow of her mother's fame and her father's neglect. She could have walked away. She could have lived off her royal trust fund and ignored the crazy woman in Beverly Hills. But Yasmin possessed a moral spine that neither of her parents' famous ex-husbands had. She stepped in. Yasmin realized that the drunk diagnosis didn't fit. She watched her mother. She saw the blank stares. She saw the way Rita would pick up an object and not know what it was. She realized this wasn't addiction. It was deterioration. She dragged Rita to specialist after specialist. In the late 70s, doctors were dismissive of aging actresses. They prescribed sedatives. They prescribed antipsychotics. They told Yasmin to put her in a sanitarium and forget about her. Yasmin refused. She fought the medical establishment with the same ferocity that Rita had fought Harry Cohn. Finally, in 1980, they found a neurologist who looked past the Gilded fame and looked at the brain scans. He delivered the diagnosis, Alzheimer's disease. It was a death sentence, but it was also a vindication. Rita wasn't a drunk. She wasn't crazy. She was sick. She was the victim of a biological thief that was stealing her memories, one by one. When Yasmin went public with the diagnosis in 1981, it sent a shockwave through the world. Alzheimer's was a stigmatized, hidden disease. People didn't talk about it. By attaching the most famous face in Hollywood history to the disease, Yasmin changed the conversation overnight. Rita Hayworth became the first public face of Alzheimer's. The love goddess became the symbol of a different kind of tragedy. Amidst this decline, the Hall of Mirrors scene from The Lady from Shanghai transformed from a cinematic metaphor into a living nightmare. One of the specific symptoms of her disease was a terrified reaction to her own reflection. When Rita walked past a mirror in her house, she would scream, seeing not Gilda, but a stranger, an intruder. Yasmin was forced to cover every mirror in the Beverly Hills home with sheets. It was the ultimate cruel manifestation of what Welles had initiated decades prior. He had shattered her self-image artistically in 1947. The disease was now shattering it, literally. The woman whose face had defined the 20th century spent her final days terrified to look at it. But where was Orson? By the early 80s, Welles was in his own decline, though he hid it better. He was hustling for money to finish his chaotic, experimental film, The Other Side of the Wind. He was voicing cartoons, Unicron in Transformers, and doing commercials for cheap wine and frozen peas. He was still the genius, but he was a genius for hire. He never visited Rita. There is no record of Orson Welles going to see Rita Hayworth in her final years. Perhaps he couldn't bear it. Perhaps his ego was too fragile to see the wreckage he had helped create. Or perhaps, in his mind, she had ceased to exist the moment he shouted "cut" on the set of The Lady from Shanghai. To Welles, people were characters. When the movie ends, the character disappears. He had written an ending for Elsa Bannister, dying on the floor of a fun house, and he seemed content to let Rita live out that ending in reality. He did, however, continue to talk about her. In intimate conversations with his friend Henry Jaglom, which were recorded, Welles admitted that Rita was the only woman he ever truly loved, but it was a selfish love. He said, "I was lucky to be with her longer than any of the others." He framed it as a conquest. He romanticized their volatility. He never expressed guilt. He never said, "I shouldn't have cut her hair." He never said, "I shouldn't have made her play a killer." He remained the hero of his own story until the bitter end. The end for Welles came first. On October 10th, 1985, Orson Welles died slumped over his typewriter, working on a script. When Yasmin told her mother, "Orson is dead," Rita didn't blink. The Alzheimer's had finally done what she could never do in life. It had evicted him from her head. He died obsessed with his legacy. She lived in a peaceful void, finally safe from the men who wanted to project their fantasies onto her. The public realized too late that they had been bullying a dying woman, not a drunk. When Rita died in 1987, the obituaries printed the photo of Gilded, ignoring the white paint and the broken spirit. It wasn't a sudden death, it was the end of a slow execution that began on a sound stage in 1946 with a pair of scissors. The final verdict lies in their resting places. Orson Welles' ashes are scattered in a dry well on a private farm in Spain, hidden from the world. Rita Hayworth rests in a marked grave in California, visited by thousands of fans and covered in fresh flowers. He tried to burn her memory to the ground, but in the end, the genius vanished and the goddess remained. It was the one scene Orson Welles couldn't direct.